how's it going? And today I'm excited to bring you this tutorial on creating water in LightWave. You don't see a lot of tutorials on making water in LightWave, and so I thought I would add my version into it. This is actually based on a version, the tutorial done by Louis du Mont. I've borrowed some of his settings, but then I've kind of taken it in another direction. Okay, and then hopefully along the way I will share some tips and tricks that I learned. So let's get started. We're going to start in Modeler. And the first tip or trick is that you need to have a very, very, very dense mesh, much like you do with Cyflex. So here we're just going to click and drag in the top view. We're just going to come down here to numeric. And just to make this easy, I'm just going to go 10 by 10. I'm just going to make it a square. And then here's where we go a little crazy. We're going to put in 400. And we're going to put in 400. Okay, and if you can't see the wiring, then it's probably dense enough. That's an easy rule. Okay, so if we, just out of curiosity, I'll hit enter, click down here on polygon, and hit W, and we have 160,000 polygons. It's a small, decent sized city of polygons. If we want to get fancy, we can just hit Q and call it surface so we know what we're looking at there. Just give it a name, and then we're just of course save it. I'm gonna save object, if it'll let me save here. We're just gonna call this water 2 and go save. And then what we'll do is we're just gonna send this object to layout. Okay, now some first things first here, our frame length of this project, let's type in 500 because all these settings are based on that length of project, 500. And of course the length of it affects the timing. This is actually going to move a little faster than I want it to move, but you can adjust that later. The next thing you probably want to do is you probably want to change your perspective. So we'll go to camera view, and there we're going to come up here, make sure we're on the camera. And then we're just going to come up here on the Y. This part actually takes some finagling here. Okay, we're going to push in on the Z, like to right about there. And then we're going to switch to rotation. Then we're going to adjust the pitch a little bit. Then we're going to come in here and we're going to zoom in. We're going to change our focal length and zoom in here. Keep tweaking it until you feel you're about filling half the frame or more. So I'm going to push in a little bit more. Right about there, maybe a little bit more. And then let's adjust the pitch a little bit, and then let's go ahead, push in a little bit more. That's about 50 millimeters. Let's adjust the pitch a little bit again. And then we'll just push in a little bit more, and that should be good. Like right about there. And of course, all these things can be adjusted later. Here's where some of the fun starts. To do this, really the first part of this, the first one is a nice dense mesh, which is what we got. And if you don't have a dense mesh, you're going to have a mess. So no dense mesh, you have a big mess. All right, and then the second thing we're going to do now, this is really the second part about creating water, is what you could call driving displacement. So you know they had that movie Driving Miss Daisy? So this is like that, except you're not driving Miss Daisy, you're driving the displacement of your mesh. And so that's why you need to have it so dense. Now what we're going to do here, we're actually going to need 3 nulls we got to create. What we can do here is just create the first one, double click there. Let's see here. The first one we're going to create, we're going to call this crump. Oops, I'm even in the box here. We're going to call it crump and go OK. And then we're going to click and drag the playhead all the way down to the end. And then for our position over here in the left corner, we are going to type in -9, -26, and the last one is -17, and go OK. And that's our first null that's going to be driving our crumple effect. Then the next one is we're going to double click and create another null, and we're going to call this turb, and go OK. For here, back in the lower left corner, we're going to type in 28. We're going to type in 10, and then we're going to type in 46. And go OK. One last one to create, and double click, and this one is going to be for Crackle, and we're going to go OK. Position for this is 8, 8, and 14. So hit play. You might not be able to see it, but it's creating those nulls, and they're all animated, and then those will create the data that animates our effect and actually gives it dynamics. So all those dimensions could be adjusted. You could actually just make one of those and drive all three, but in this case we have ones driving each of the procedurals a little differently. Where most of our work is going to take place here, I actually have to again have some notes here because there's quite a bit of stuff going on here. Go into the surface editor. We only have our surface, our water surface, and we need to do quite a bit of things in here, but nothing too bad. And this could actually be simplified. You probably don't need to go this far into it. This is just based on the Louis du Mont one that he did. And so you wouldn't necessarily have to go this far. If you just wanted to use a crumple and a turbulence and an add, that might be enough for you. We're just going the extra mile just to be crazy, okay? What we're gonna need in here is we're gonna come in here and we're gonna go gradient and double click there, and there's our gradient. And then we're going to come up here and we need two turbulences. So we type in turb again, it should be right there. And you double click it once, double click it twice. We got those. And then we're going to need we can type in CR, and there's our crackle, and there's our crumple, and we got that. And then let's see, we need an incidence. So we type in INC, there's our incidence, double click that. And then we're going to need a scalar. And there it is there, double click that. And then lastly, but not leastly, I know that's not a word, add, we can go double click there once, double click there twice, okay? And that's all that we need to really recreate any kind of really water effect. I think this would do it for you. How do we want to get started? So what I'm gonna do for this, just because there's so many things to do in here, and I'm gonna try to do this as quickly as possible without going crazy fast, is I'm just going to go through and add the settings to all of these, and then we're going to go back and hook everything up. And then you'll see once we get going here, you'll see, let's see, can we see this at the same time? Because this is kind of cool to see. I'll switch into wireframe texture. No, wait, this one, wireframe texture, wireframe shaded, I think. And we'll see eventually, we'll see these effects coming in online as we hit each one. Okay, so without further ado, let's just go ahead and get these settings done. We're going to double click on crumple, and the color is, all these are grays. So, and there's white, black, or gray. There's no actual anything other. So the crumple is 253. So we just come in here and we're just going to type 253, 253. The good thing is once you do this, you can save these nodes and you don't have to keep doing this over and over again. So once you kind of get the effect you want, you only got to do it once. So opacity is 58. Our small scale is 0.33. And, I meant to say 0.33. Frequencies, actually, the lower the number, the softer you get. So that's something to keep in mind as you're looking at your water effect. And amplitude is 10. So once we create our effect, and we don't like it, like it's not working out quite right, we can come in here and soften things up and play around. You just got to open this window and make adjustments to these while you're looking at the waves, and you can figure out for yourself settings that might work better for you. So just double checking, that's 253, 58, 0.33 to 10%, and the driver is going to be what? There it is, crumple. And that one is done. And it should look kind of like that if you've got it done, you followed along correctly. Okay, so let's see here. This turbulent length color here is going to be 54. And I should mention on the color, the darker the color, the softer the effect. So if you're trying to soften an effect and you don't like you see too much turbulence, one way you can control it is by just darkening it. So when you see a darker foreground color, that means that the effect is being softened. And the opacity, by the same token, also softens it. So these are just ways of softening the procedural. And 0.5, and the contrast here is 80 there. And the reference object here is going to be turbulence. And the scaling here is just 5, 5, 5. So just 5, enter. Sometimes when you hit enter, it's supposed to jump down to the next box, but then sometimes it doesn't do that. Okay, and then that's that one. So that's 54, 60.5, 80 frequency. Oh, I meant to put 2 on that. 2. 2 and 100 and 555. Okay. But did I have frequency on this? Let me double check. The frequency on that was 2. Okay, great. And again, you should see, it should kind of look like that right there. And then we'll go into this other turbulence. We got this other one. There's nothing driving this particular one. This one is going to be white. So we just can click that box and make it white. And then let's see what we got. The opacity is 51%. 51%. And 50. Frequency is 1. Oops. Down here. Frequency is 1. Bump amplitude is that. And the scale is 6. And I'm assuming, I'm not sure why this one is 10, but I believe it's because of the original model of this was more elongated. So that setting, I think it's just a minor tweak right there to have this 6610. More stretching it out, I believe, along this axis there. And that would just, again, be a preference. And then the last one is going to be Crackle. So for this, the color is 196. Is that right? 196. So we go 196, 196, and then 196, and we go OK. And let's see. This one we're gonna invert the alpha on that one, and the opacity is way down on this. This is 15. So this is just a very subtle effect, you can imagine. The frequencies look like they're always about 2 or 1. Bump amplitude, let me double check here. The bump amplitude is 100, and of course what's driving this is our Crackle, right? And then for scaling is going to be 444. Okay, so no doubt these settings were derived manually by looking at the waves themselves and then tweaking them to however the person wanted the waves to look. Okay, and now all we got to do is the gradient here, and this one is just a color adjustment. So let's do that here. Let's see, gradient, and the color adjustment is, for the first key, the color is going to be 254. So it's just 254. It's actually it's actually white. So we'll just click there and make it white. And then about, I don't know, almost halfway down, like right about there, the color is going to be, I'm just having to check some notes here. The color is 34, 34, 34. So that's 34, 34, 34. Okay. And then we come down, I'm almost to the bottom, like right about there. And the color is going to be 3. So we just type in 3, 3, 3, 3, and OK. And then we come down here to the very last one, and this one is completely black. So you just click on the black square, and that's that. And that's that. And that's everything right there. So now all we have to do is, now this part's the kind of cool part, but actually I don't mind doing this part because I think it's kind of fun. The color here on the turbulence is going to go into rotation, and then the color here is going to go into the add. And then our Crackle, which is actually here, the color from this, the color from our Crackle can actually go into here, like that. And then we're going to bring this add, and this result is going to go into this node, and this color is going to come into here. And this section right here, all these settings that we just did, is what's driving our displacement. So let me see, I hope this works. So now if I drag this, I'm trying to see, can you see all this? If I drag this now into displacement, you'll see that nothing happens. And the reason that is that we don't have the surface displacement set yet. So I'm going to come over here and click on the water, and I'm going to click on the properties, and I'm going to come here to surface displacement. I'm going to double click on that, And I'm going to type in 500 mm, and this better work or somebody's going to be in trouble. Yeah, there we go. Okay, so that's our water. So now this is the second level of the process right here, right? We have our dense mesh, and now we're also going to, the other thing I should mention talking of mesh is that we can even subdivide this even further. So if I go into properties on here and double click subdivision, I'm going to pop this at 12 right here. Now, and that should help smooth out. Because what happens if you don't have a dense mesh is where it's like you could say white capping. You'll see up here, you'll start actually seeing the polygons. And of course, that doesn't really help the effect anyway. But now if I hit play, you can see you've got your dynamics of the water moving, right? Which is pretty darn cool, right? But from previous experience, like I can see right here, this is going to be trouble. The mesh, as dense as it is may not be dense enough. So I noticed even on the original that I watched, I saw if you look at still frames, you can see the polygons on the caps here. And some you might be able to cheat that by blurring it, but to be honest with you, I think one of the takeaways from all this water is that you've got to realize the limitations of it. Like, unless you can figure out a workaround to it. So part of my solution to this, because this will show polygons. Let me see if we can see anything in VPR yet. No. Okay, so this is almost like moving to the second part of the tutorial, and that's like, well, how do we actually make this start looking like water now? Or I should say the third part of the tutorial. And that's a good question, right? Because we do want it to look like water. But before we do that, let me go back into the surface editor and finish hooking up these nodes here. So the incidence, let me double check something right here. The incidence, the result of the incidence is going to plug into the input here, and then the color here is going to go into specular. And then the scalar here is for translucency, which, you know, we could just do this also on the main board if we wanted to. So I don't know if that's enough to see any difference yet, but I don't know. But that's basically all of our settings there, okay? So now the question is, how do we get this thing to start looking actually like water? Because it doesn't really look like water yet, does it? What I decided to do in this place, this also goes to the next lesson about water, is that the water is a reflection of its environment. So in this particular case, let's go into render here under GI options. We actually don't have GI on for this, so we turn that off. And you can see here, I noticed already just by looking, this is a good example. You see how blocky everything looks right there? Of course, we got to go into the surface editor and click on smoothing, and that'll take care of a lot of that for us, but not all of it. Not all of that, although it looks pretty darn smooth up there. You'll see we can still get polygons showing up there. So anyway, to get this to looking like water, we can change the color of this. We can try changing the color of this to something like 200, make it wider instead of grayer, 200. But you'll notice it didn't really change it kind of whitened it up a little bit, but it didn't really change very much yet, right? What would change this a lot is if we go into our backdrop, and if I turn the backdrop off, you can see that kind of looks cool. But here's the main thing. If we simply just go in here and change this to blue, that's the background. But then if we click here and turn this to blue, it's not coming through. And the reason why is that this is still solid. So what we're going to have to do is come into a surface editor, and if we hit transparency, it'll start to look like water. So you really have to push this up to maybe like, I don't know, 80, 90 for the transparency. And the other thing that's going to start making it look like water, now you can see also too that we lost some of our angle here. So if I drag this back to the first position and I go to camera properties, let me just go into texture mode so it renders faster. I'm only at 58, so I can still crop in here quite a bit. So I'm gonna punch in there a little bit there. Okay, and now I can go back into VPR here. And there is starting to look like water, right? I mean, I was actually looking at water today, and it looks like that. The only other thing, there's a couple more things that we could mess around with on our light is important. Of course, lighting is very important. And we have our distant light right now, but let's switch that to an area light. We can actually pump this up. Now I made that background pretty dark there, so let me go back into the backdrop here. Is that the ground color? So let me see. What happens if I change that? Yeah, maybe not quite. Maybe a lighter blue, like that, something like that. Yeah, something like that. And I think it's probably best to turn off effects specular. Then you can play around with this light. You can try to bump it up. And of course that's going to create a big effect for you. And then also the location of the light. So make sure I'm on the light here. And if I move the light itself, let's go into the light view actually and see what that looks like. Oh, I'm not even really, I can barely even see it. I'm way out of view here. So let me go back in here to texture shaded. So let me literally get my, is that my light? This is my light I'm moving, right? Okay. Let me get my light in a better position here. Let's see, like right there. And let me go in the top view for 1 second here. Let's see, I'm off a little. I want to be from the side, I think, like there. And I'll turn it here. And then I go back into light view and take a look at this thing. Yeah, okay, now it does let me come up. I'm just coming up on the y-axis there. Hopefully I'm not messing things up too bad. Let's go into camera view. And let's go into VPR. Yeah, so anyway, I think you want the light coming from the side, and then you can really jack this up and really start changing the way things look by bringing the light up or down. It's all, again, it's going to be all up to you how you want it. I'm trying to think if I left anything out. I guess if I had to summarize, kind of run through camera properties, we're zoomed in, nothing else really special here. If you do enable motion blur, you're really going to slow this thing down like a lot. So that's probably something you don't want to do on here. For the light, all we have is the area light, and we can really pump that up and we can bring it in from the side and and I would say turn off effect specular for your light. Let's see. And then of course for our water, where mostly everything happens in the surface editor, you can play around with your actual color there. And I recommend adding transparency, playing around with that. And then everything else happens if you go into the node graph. You've got your textures, which are basically driving this. So what this is one last thing I will say on all this. You can save this out. So if you go to save, you can go export selected. You select all these. So you go select all, and then you can export these and save them so you don't have to do this again. So really only have to do this once. I'm going to mention that you could also get by without all of this. Like you could just use Turbulence and Crumple and an add. You don't have to add, you can get rid of these and these and these just to do your displacement of your surface. But what I was going to show you is, interestingly, the darker these are, the softer the impact is. So I actually did, when I rendered in my first render, I was seeing polygons. And so what I had to do was go in and tone these down. So I'll give you an example of this. So on Crumple, because you can see it's a lot of white and dark, so you know it's going to be a pretty strong effect, right? Oops. Let me do this. If I come down here and I double click on Crumple, and I have this control here, if I dial down the opacity, I'm actually dialing down the effect. See that? See how the water went down like that? The same thing. So I actually dialed down the crumple because I was noticing too much white capping, and it was peaking too much. And then the same thing on the turbulence. I noticed this turbulence was having a lot of effect because it was, I could tell just from the white, the contrast in it is the white and darkness means it's going to be having a lot more effect. So on here, on the turbulence, I actually just dialed it down a little bit too. Is it this one? Yeah, so you can dial this one down. And again, it's just going to tone the whole thing down. And then also the turbulence, if you change the color here, if you come in here and you go to a darker color, it's going to tone it down even more. So when you darken the colors on these procedurals, you're toning down the effect, and you just kind of adjust these while you're looking at the water. You won't end up with that white capping that's going to get you some kind of crazy looking polygons coming out of the water and things like that. So by adjusting your colors, making them darker, and by dialing down your opacity, it basically has the same effect. And then you can also play around with scaling. If you notice like one effect's going too far or too much, you can adjust it. So a lot of it is once you kind of figure out how these are driving your displacement, then you really have the key to having the dynamics of water. You'll have the dynamics of the water. And see, like right now, it's a lot more toned down. So if you play it, and then let's say you thought it was moving too fast, you would just come in here, like you would pick your nulls. You could pick a null here, go all the way to the end, and then just shorten the position, slow you down if it was going too fast. See here, it's looking kind of wild up there, and I could imagine, let's look at that MVPR. Oh wow. You can see where it's too much, right? So I can tell that that's too much of an effect right there. So I could put in a shallow depth of field and some blur and blur that out. And here it's not too bad. It's actually not too bad here, but you're really pushing the limit right there with that. I think in the other video, what they did is they just did a shallow, blurred it out. And that was my last thing I was going to say. Once you've rendered out your video, if you want to add more contrast and saturation, I would actually do that in your video editing program or whatever editing program you use. And I don't usually use LightWave for doing those kinds of effects. So what I'll do is once I render this out in my video editor, I will add the contrast and maybe add some saturation and things like that. If I want to blur up like this top level here, I'll blur that out so that you don't really see that up on the top there, right? But again, it's just for a second, you may not notice it, but actually a lot of it's pretty smoothed out. But it's just one of those things you got to kind of play with and see what looks right for you. But all the procedurals that you added can be toned down. I realize this was a kind of a long tutorial, and I appreciate you hanging in there and watching it. And I would really, if you have a way of making water that looks great, I would love to know your settings or see a tutorial from you. Thanks a lot, and have a great day, and I will talk to you later.